welcome. I'm afraid you're going to get less glowing blue shit from me. It's going to be slightly less exciting. But I liked what John was saying. I like the theme of community. I like the theme of partnership between engineers and artists and inventors. And that's something I'm going to touch on a little bit as well. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Phil Parsonage. I'm CTO at Foundry. We're a software manufacturer for about 28 years now. I'm also an Academy Software Foundation general member representative. Very excited to be here in person. I've attended a lot of these events virtually. I'm also quite excited to speak quite early in the day because my jet lag is terrible. And if I was doing this at 5 o'clock, I think it would be quite a different talk. I'm going to try and do 4 things today. The first one is reflect a little bit on our history, where the open source community in VFX has come from and how we're doing. I'm going to engage in a bit of educated, possibly uneducated, I'll let you pick, speculation as to what the future might look like and maybe highlight a challenge or two along the way. I'm afraid you're going to have to listen to me drone on about Foundry, because that's why I'm here, but I want to talk a bit about how we're trying to contribute to that community and how we've gone about it. I also want to pitch you on getting involved. There's been lots of discussion today about involvement from engineers. I'd also like to pitch for artist involvement and involvement beyond that. Not as part of the presentation, there's no audience participation, it's fine, but in terms of generally being a part of the community. I'm going to say community a lot. So let me take you back to 2011. According to Merriam-Webster, amongst the words of the year were grammable, which I still didn't know was a phrase, and blockchain. So blockchain was a new word in 2011, and a younger, possibly slightly hairier on top, Phil Parsonage, went to FMX to give a talk on a similar topic on open source. Now, the wonderful thing about the internet is that you can see what you said 13 years ago. The terrible thing about the internet is you can see what you said 13 years ago. And sadly, some idiot who is on this stage said, the future will be awesome as long as we don't screw it up. Which I think was me trying to be clever, but I'm pretty sure that's true at any point in history. You know, it's going to be great unless we screw it up. I even tried to insert a language-based pun into a talk to a hall full of non-native English speakers, which bombed so badly, only one person, one of my colleagues at the back of the hall, laughed very, very loudly. I'm hopeful today will go slightly better. So what did we talk about? Oh, that's a bad laugh. What did we talk about 13 years ago? So I talked a lot about OpenFX. So Bruno Nicoletti and a variety of other people had done an amazing job on trying to get an image processing plugin API that meant we didn't have to port plugins across every single application that wanted to use them. Still a great example of how to version an API, how to make an API that you can extend without breaking backwards compatibility. Really happy that's now an incubation project at the Academy Software Foundation. Having a foundation is a huge step forward from where we were. So Philippe Laprince gave a talk about a website he'd set up called Open Source VFX. That had about 50 projects on it that he'd curated to be the useful ones, the ones that weren't zombie projects, the ones that weren't just a piece of code someone had thrown out as open source. I was really happy when I went to look at that website, because I was going to screenshot it for this presentation, that it now redirects to the Academy website. So we went from one person having the motivation to go and curate those websites to a foundation and a meeting where we're sitting around these tables today, which is huge. Larry Gritz, who I saw earlier today, talked about OpenImageIO and said, after I left my last company, I was walking away from years of work and it killed me to be back at the starting point. I'd done this work 4 times. I do wonder how many PNG loaders have been written by the people in this room over the last 20 years that Larry has saved us from. I did also note that Larry has stayed at the same company since that talk, so I guess you've stayed on the safe side there. Bill Polson talked about OpenSubdiv, Pixar's first, I believe, foray into the open source world, and now we have USD in our world from that organisation. CG Channel wrote up the event with a number of comments, but I thought this was particularly significant. It was universally felt that file formats like OpenEXR and PTEX are easier to open source than entire applications or even GUIs. Now, I think that's still probably true to some extent. There's clearly in Blender and other applications, there are exceptions to that, but it's still probably easier to think about file formats as something that you open source rather than slightly more complex things where there's more opinion, there's a UI, there's a UX, there's more things that require more and more discussion. And it made me think a bit about where we go next with open source. So interop, both now and in the past, has meant exchanging file formats. So that's pretty simple. It's a clear win. Image formats, which is where Larry started, they've clearly been a pain point for this industry. We don't need, please don't make another image file format. We don't need another one. I can see some agreement. I think that's where Larry started from. So the problem's not limited to images. It's used in lots of places where we lay off files to disk. So what's emerged is a pattern of file format and library that accompanies it. And I've got a few listed here. I do like the fact that we've namespaced our projects generally with open at the start. There's also a pattern of putting IO at the end with lots of these projects, just waiting for Alembic to get with the program. But I started thinking about how other industries deal with this. So other industries with large amounts of data. And it made me think a bit about BI systems. So BI systems can pull together data from lots of different sources to allow you to pull together a data pipeline. They're not laying off CSV files to disk to try and do that share. They're not sharing file formats. It's all live linked. Connections aren't laying things off and reloading them. And I wonder if that's the challenge that I think we started on, but I think we'll consider. And that's to think about procedural interoperability. So not laying things off to disk. So where that procedural nature is very prevalent in our industry is where I think we've struggled to find open source initiatives. So rigging is a really good example. Procedural interoperability is going to mean that the runtimes need to be consistent between tools. So there's a few examples here that are going to end up doing evaluation at runtime. It's not just loading data off a disk. And to different extents, and apologies to the USD crowd, I did use the wrong logo on the slides that went out for this. I used the old logo rather than the Alliance for Open USD one, but I am happy that there's an open in there, so it's beginning to fit my pattern. So these are all technologies that we use at Foundry, that we're developing on, that we're using, and I'll take you through a couple of examples of what we're doing with them. So OpenTimelineIO. It needs to represent time warps, transitions, and other effects consistent with the creative expectations. That's a really posh way of saying it needs to look the same. So it's all very well being able to represent them across multiple applications, but the creative intent that is being encoded into that file needs to look the same everywhere. When I first wrote this slide, the person that helped me with the slide wrote that the result should be unsurprising. That's why it got reframed consistent with creative expectations, but I do like the idea of unsurprising as an acceptance criteria for any software. OpenAssetIO. So this is a project dear to me. Tom, David, and Elliot, and various other people at Foundry have worked on this to a huge extent. And this is an effort to wean pipelines off files on disk to a more asset-centric workflow. So it does that using a client-server model to try and make the changes you make to an application less intrusive. So if you've got multiple asset systems, you can have that link in the back end of this client server. There's no logic in the front end. Similarly, pipeline config can all belong in the back end. Hopefully your pipeline can evolve quicker. And there's even going to be some nice tricks we may be able to do through this in the future to do with ranged access on assets, or even, hopefully, having procedural access to data through these APIs. So the future is procedural. Sounds great, right? It's going to be hard, is the bad news. It needs to be deterministic. So if it needs to look the same in every application, it's going to need to evaluate the same. So for OpenAssetIO, that's probably quite easy. If it tells you where the asset is and you use the same asset, great. If we're starting to process pixel data as engines within engines, or if we're starting to run simulation data within engines, that's going to be much harder. Even more so in a world where our runtime technology is diverging and you may have someone on different hardware trying to evaluate the same procedural, and you'll end up with different results possibly. And you can't build it in a bubble, so software vendors are going to have to work together, but are also going to need, to John's point, to work with artists, and the open source engagement model is probably the right one for us here. But it's going to involve us sharing more than code as well. If we're running procedurally within each other's applications, we're going to need to share RAM, we're going to need to share threads, we need to share processes. It's a fun problem, but it's going to be tough. The other thing we're going to have to share is possibly data. Open source is slightly different here. So a model for machine learning can be open sourced, but if it's not been trained on publicly available data, and I should say I'm not a lawyer and I will not give any advice on this because it's hard, but we might have to take on that challenge. I also wanted to reinforce the point of collaboration here. So Foundry in 2019 open sourced an ML server for Nuke. It was our first foray into machine learning in Nuke. And we open sourced that. It's still on GitHub now. And it set some conversations off both internally and externally that led us to creating Copycat. And if you haven't seen Copycat, it copies sequence-specific events from a small number of frames in a sequence and rolls it out across the entire sequence. It's a great bit of technology. For that, we had to make something called a cat file, which is a way of embedding a machine learning network to go into Nuke. And out of that came the Cattery, which is a place where open source models can be submitted and they can be downloaded and used as part of Nuke. So a whole bunch of ideas from community came from that first open sourcing. So what are we doing at Foundry against this? So we try and work in incremental collaborative steps. So that means not doing a big bang of, hey, we've introduced a new thing, isn't it great, off you go, use it. So we try and work with people to plan and order our next steps at any point. And you can see this in the way we've implemented, and Jonathan's here who's working on this, USD in Nuke, where there's a new system growing up alongside the old one. You can also see it in the way we've introduced native USD functionality to Katana bit by bit. That was in the Katana 7 release at the back end of last year, and there'll be more of that coming later. We've also tried to be good citizens. I'm sure we can improve on this, but we've tried our best. So we contributed OpenAssetIO to the Academy Software Foundation, and all the work we do on that is in the GitHub. It's all in the open. It's not a project we do internally. Everything is out there. We try and be active in technology steering committees, and we try and build things into roadmaps, because there is a problem with new technology like OpenAssetIO. If no customer asks for it, the DCC vendors won't build it, and if the DCC vendors won't build it, no one's going to use it. So sometimes someone has to go first, and that's what we're doing with OpenAssetIO. A couple of calls to action. So OpenTimelineIO, we have beta support in Nuke Studio and Hero. That beta tag will be taken off this year. It's a great noise. That will be taken off this year. We're also working on some new parts of the standard. So the collaboration opportunities you can see on this slide are areas where the team want to try and propose native representations where they think there's more work to do. And we'll be putting in standards proposals to the committee. But if anyone out there wants to work with us on this, please do. The team would be really happy to hear from you, unless they get snowed with responses, in which case I've really sold them out. OpenAssetIO, again, incremental. So there's a tech preview in Nuke. We're going to build on that this year. So that first phase has the project in beta, and it's in the incubation phase for the Academy. I'm pretty sure the beta tag will be taken off this year for the OpenAssetIO project, and there'll be more work to roll this into Nuke and Katana this year. And you can see what's going on in GitHub. I actually took this feedback on the right-hand side for my second call to action directly from the GitHub. So again, please get involved. We had a really successful Birds of a Feather session at SIGGRAPH this year with nearly 100 people, and the Slack channel's pretty active as well. The last example I'd like to give you is about Aeon, which is an open source pipeline by the guys at Input. So I talked a lot about collaboration and opportunities to work together. This is a great example of how the open source model gives us opportunity to integrate things sooner and more transparently. It also means that we can work on workflows rather than just implementing something in one DCC in isolation and not be an island. And I don't think this collaboration would have happened without things being open source. So what should we do next? So I actually think sometimes we miss the artist part of some of the work we do in open source. And I think they're pretty important to this, which is why I like John's point earlier. The more feedback you can give us, the better. Be that to Foundry, be that to one of the other vendors, be that to someone that's a part of that project where you work. Also, think about problems that you want to solve. There are some things that open source is fantastic for. Certainly open standards and the interop piece is a huge part of what is valuable about this foundation. If you're a pipeline developer, I've been a bit more direct here. Join a steering committee, come to the meetings, be a part of something. You'll learn something, you'll meet some fantastic people. Again, I suspect you know of problems that we should solve. I suspect you may have solved some of those problems. I suspect you might be able to share some of the solutions to those problems. And if you're a vendor, look, come and talk to us. I know we're a vendor as well. I know there's competition, but the open source world isn't where we're going to compete, or at least it shouldn't be. I think we have something very special in this industry, both with this foundation, but also with the work that Nick Cannon, who I saw somewhere earlier, has done on VFX platform. It's pretty remarkable that we have studios that in some ways compete with one another, software vendors that in some ways compete with one another, and add a customer relationship into that, and we manage to come out with something that makes sense to all of us, and we manage to work together. So we should build on that. I'm nearly done. I would like to thank Matt Mazarol for his help in preparing for this presentation. And I'd like to leave you with one final thought, which shows that I've only learned 3 words in 13 years. The future will be awesome as long as we don't screw it up by not collaborating. We've got a great opportunity here, but we can't do it in silos. The complexities of procedurals and procedural libraries, as we go down that route, we're going to need more collaboration rather than less. Thank you for listening.